So welcome to the Node.js and Oracle Database Office Hours for August 2019. We had a big month this month with the release of Node-oracledb version 4. Dan, were you going to do some demoing?
Yeah, if there's time in the end, I have a few demos we can walk through to look at the new object and record support.
Sure. I have a fairly open slide which just says 4.0, so I don't have a lot of other content to prepare. This is really an Ask Me Anything session. We have on the phone, I don't think Blaine is here, but Dan McGann, who's the evangelist for all things JavaScript in Oracle Database world. Anthony Turinga, who does a lot of the work there actually for the driver, and also works on some of the other drivers in the Oracle Database Access group. Myself, product manager, so sort of just the general busybody behind the scenes, and Blaine's an evangelist also in this area who's not with us at this stage. And I see a chat's come up. That's Anthony putting the Ask Question chat. So if you see the flashing light, that's the chat sessions. Most welcome to ask questions at any stage. So we do have an icebreaker theme before we throw it open to questions. And the icebreaker theme really is Node-oracledb 4. And I do not have any slideware. Why would we need slideware for something like that? We do have a lot of stuff up there on, obviously, on GitHub, github.io, where we keep our sort of major homepage, has all of the great user manual. A lot of new things have gone into this version. I'm showing you the back end here, the raw markdown format version of things like our changelog. And just to do a recap, I know we've given a little bit of information over the months of what is coming. But the big thing, I think, internally for us was that we did refactor the driver to use this NAPI layer. And that gave us some advantages. The NAN layer, which was a sort of abstraction layer for our C-level driver code, was kind of getting a little long in the tooth. Effort really was moving towards this NAPI layer, which is much better in many ways. It let us refactor our code base into a pure C code layer instead of having to C++, so that has some compiler advantages. Obviously, with more support going into it, that's always going to be a better thing. You kind of have to move to it eventually anyway. It also, in particular, allows binaries to be more portable, and that is because it actually has better portability, not just for our driver layer, but for users as well of the binary modules that we ship. And that's a significant advantage. So it really means in future, as new Node versions come out, you're almost certainly not going to have to update your Node-oracledb driver. If you don't want to, obviously we recommend keeping up to date with everything, but at least you won't have a sort of sudden breakage where you're not expecting it, waiting for us to catch up. You still do need full Oracle client libraries. There's just a thick client way to access the database across the Oracle network. And then the big main other feature, which Dan will demo at some stage, is this support for Oracle types and collections, name types and collections, querying and binding. And that's pretty significant in many ways because we do know a lot of Oracle sites, if I can call them that, Oracle users do use a lot of stored procedural language, PL/SQL packages and types just to obviously encapsulate logic. And we want to make sure that logic is available to all of you Node-oracledb users. So that's a pretty major feature, just a little entry here, but that was probably the biggest effort there in terms of the upgrade. A lot of design decisions trying to make it smooth and easy to use. A lot of testing went into that as well, thanks to our testers, as always. We also added support for Oracle Advanced Queuing, and there are a couple of queues types there supported, the raw queues, which is basically strings and buffers. In terms of node data types that you can just send backwards and forwards. And advanced queuing is an Oracle database feature. So it's available in a lot of all the other languages out there, Java, Python, PL/SQL. So you can now interoperate a lot better with some of those other languages if you've got those in your environments. Since we had objects support, we could actually support what they call object queues, which is kind of nice and neat. Implicit results, probably not a widely used feature. This is a way of, oops, you can see all my dirty laundry there. Probably not a widely used feature, but it is useful nonetheless. here I have I'm not going to run this. You can go and pull it out of the demo directory. Here I have a PL/SQL, block. Could be procedure, could be a function, whatever you like. There's no sort of bind variables. There isn't the need to have a procedure passing in values. There are no bind variables in here, no colon prefix values. We're just using this return result method. And then later down in the code, when you've executed the block, we now have a new attribute, implicit results, which is a cursor you can iterate over, a result set you can iterate over. So that's a kind of little handy shortcut for people who don't want to fuss around with bind variables and working out how to do binding and what goes on with types and where to set them. Lob data, this was actually really more for objects, just to let you get lobs out of the objects. Just one way to actually improve the lob experience there. DB type name. So we started, and this is a useful thing to note, we've started some work to kind of revamp a little bit about how we handle data types in Node-oracledb. I'm not sure whether it should be noted a little lower. What shall I jump the screen? Yeah, we renumbered, if you look at the bottom, we renumbered some of the type constants. And so we've also got type names coming in as well into the metadata. So we, in future versions, will be looking at how that works. And if, as you know, probably do know that Oracle has a sort of client type and a database type, the column type in the data or the PL/SQL bind type, and they don't always have to map, and there can be kind of conversion going backwards and forwards. The common example is just between strings and numbers. If you bind a string, it can be inserted in Oracle into a number. And we want to try and work out that mapping. We have defaults at the moment, but we want to give you some more power, particularly when you're trying to work with PL/SQL objects and you've got methods with different signatures where you want to make sure the right signature is chosen. Sorry, methods of the same name with different signatures. Bind in a little bit of a few tweaks there. User requests, continuous screen notifications, so just a few little tweaks, a few little extra events added so you can work out when databases start up and shut down. And I skipped over up above that we can get notifications also from advanced queuing. So you don't always have to be listening. You can wait for a notification before going and trying dequeuing a message from the queue. Bug fixes, of course, we're getting down to the bug fixes territory. Connection.current schema, new attribute which you can set. You may be familiar with this. This is really the prefix that goes onto objects. So select star from emp. If you have a current schema set to x, then it'll be automatically mapped to select star from x.emp. And the reason it's always worth noting is because of round trips. And we always try and reduce round trips. So packets being sent across from Node-oracledb to the database and back again, messages going backwards and forwards. If you have to use this alter session statement, which is a perfectly valid way of setting the current schema, that's a round trip across to the database. It's an execute. Database changes state and comes back and says, yes, I've changed the state. With a new attribute, there's no round trip when you set it. It kind of gets piggybacked onto the next message which goes across to the database, which is when it actually makes sense. You don't actually need to know that information until you actually use the database. So what I'm really getting around is, yes, we've got a new little attribute, but actually anything you do in Node-oracledb, watch those round trips. And there's a new section in the manual which speaks a little bit about that and how you can work out what round trips are going on. Type constants. Oh, and this actually popped up even on Slack yesterday. We knew that having the previous oracledb.object constant was going to be confusing now that we have object binding. And somebody indeed was trying to bind some kind of type as an object. So we've kind of tried to renumber, so we're going to start using these new constants everywhere we can, just so that people are a little more aware that this constant really is only for the out format type. And that out format type is whether or not you get arrays of objects or arrays of JavaScript objects or arrays of arrays back for each row. Anthony did a little bit of cool work there with that object output and actually improve the performance relative to the array format. And that is kind of pretty significant. We still haven't made object format the default. I know a lot of people do use it. Obviously, that's a big shift if we suddenly swap to default like that. And the array format is still going to be faster than the object format, just because it has to do less work internally. The driver, that is. Anthony did some work at the lower levels. You may remember that Node-oracledb sits on top of what we call the ODPIC wrapper. So there's layers and layers and layers. That's the generic layer that we use for a number of drivers, for our Python driver, Node driver. Other third parties use it for Go drivers, Julia drivers, Rust drivers. And Anthony did a little bit of work there to improve the performance of lobs. Again, sort of behind the scenes, you may not notice, and to do some serious benchmarking. This one was we did change, and this is interesting. And we've had one report of an issue with this change, so I really want to know if you do have issues. Let us know. And the issue reported was there was a timeout when creating the connection pool, and then the workaround was to explicitly set this back to false. But the reason we set this events to true was because we're running in a multi-threaded environment, so there's no overhead of setting it. There's work in the background if you're not running in a multi-threaded environment. That's not true with Node, so we technically no overhead. And then it gives us a better out-of-the-box experience. So events mode lets Oracle work with a CQN, work with fast application notification if your database service is configured to send database events. If you've got standby databases and you want to know what's going up and down for planned and unplanned outages. And so we just basically wanted to make this give the best available service when it was, database was configured for it. So the application developer didn't have to think about it. As I say, we had one report of an issue, still not quite sure what's going on with that, because you know what it's like on GitHub trying to get information backwards and forwards. It's not like a telephone call with screen sharing. So just keep an eye on that and let us know if you do have issues, and then we'll have to make a decision about whether we revert this or not. Along with that whole refactoring we mentioned with an API, there was a whole bunch of updates to JavaScript syntaxes, class methods are configurable, etc., reviewed all sort of error handling. And then there's just a few tweaks down into the SOTA layer, this is our document storage layer. You may remember we have the traditional relational access code path, and we have the simple Oracle document access layer. So we've got some bulk insert methods, which are really cool. Just be aware that these are sort of in preview status for the moment. But the rest of the API is out of preview status if you're using the latest Oracle client libraries. And some more sort of tweaks and bug fixes, etc., new tests, new examples, and things like that. So overall, in fact, not a lot of bug fixes, which is really good because that means we don't have a lot of bugs. I'm kind of pleased to see that. And that's kind of it for the rundown. A big release, took a long time. Kind of really rounds out the database feature set that we have here in Node-oracledb, really making it a great driver to use. And I hope you enjoy it. Let me throw over to Dan. Dan, do you want to go through some of the object?
Sure. Yeah.
Sure. Okay. Let me stop sharing and let you share.
Folks, if you have any questions while I go over this, feel free to interrupt. We can just talk about things as we go. What I wanted to show you were a couple examples based on some work that I'd done before. So for example, I had this blog post about, this was from 2017, PL SQL record types in the Node.js driver. And I'll walk you through a basic example of creating a package and then how you could invoke a procedure within that package. This case was rather simple, and then it got a little more complex down below. And this is all pre-object support. So what I want to show you is first that package that we're trying to work with here. And you can see in the package spec that I have a thing, and it appears I broke something here. See if I can fix this real quick. I believe that was the original. Okay, here we go. So the spec is pretty simple. We have one record type, which hopefully everybody's familiar with. A lot of the examples, the new object support are based on objects within the database, which some folks are using, but a lot of folks just stick with basic PL SQL record types. So I have an example here of one of those with a couple different properties. There's another type based on that record type, which is just an associative array of thing T, so another type. And then proc1 here just takes in the scalar thing T, and then proc2 takes in the array. And so the question was, how can we call each of these? And what I have here is some before and after shots. And so this is how I could invoke the regular proc. And the idea is I'm going to have some JavaScript thing, object that we want to essentially move into the database so we can invoke this procedure. And you see I have a string, number, and a basic date. And so the PL SQL that I needed back in 2017 looked a little bit like this. Let me make this bigger. So basically, I had a bunch of wrapper code. What I really wanted was just this bit here. But because record types weren't supported in terms of binding in, I had to break down the binds into what was supported. And that was arrays, basic arrays, but only two types. I had the support for string and number. So what I would do is, in this case, we're not even doing the array type, but I would, in my PL SQL wrapper code, declare an instance of the thing I actually want to use, in this case, my package thing T, and then I could access its properties and bring in the values via individual scalar binds in this case. So the binds are really simple, and the wrapper code isn't too bad. And if I call this is node test one before, we call that, it works fine. Eventually, you'll just see that the connection.execute fires with the PL SQL binds you see above, and then we just log out the fact that it was called successfully. The after was just a lot nicer. And so if you see in before, we're at about 58 lines of code, and after down to about 47, so about 10 lines of code fewer. JS thing looks a lot alike, but what needed to change, if you note here, the parts one, these are labels in the objects that are what you might see in normal JavaScript code, the camel case type name. Over here, the names had to change to match the actual column names. And by default, Oracle, as you already likely know, it uppercases things. So unless you force case sensitivity with double quotes, it's going to leave it in upper. So these had to become uppercase, but the rest is still the same. The SQL code, as you can see, just got a lot simpler. I was just able to say call, and then what I wanted to call, and my bind type, that's all I needed to do. So the bind type's here. The type itself, I can use a string and say it's my package.thingT. And I think Anthony's probably going to tell me I should probably do HR. Is that right, Anthony?
Technically, yes.
Okay. So follow best practices and put your schema name in there. I was just taking a shortcut. And
so
then the value.
It's worthwhile saying why, and that is because there's a cache of the object type in Node-oracledb to avoid having to do those round trips I talked about backwards and forwards. And if you don't, the cache is based on the fully qualified name. So if you don't use a fully qualified name, it's not going to match in the local cache in Node-oracledb. It's going to go to the database to try and find the type definition, and come back. So there's going to be a round trip, and you might do that if you're in a high performance environment and you're trying to bind lots of objects. You'd be doing those lots of extra round trips unnecessarily. So use the fully qualified name if you can.
I've updated my code. Fingers crossed it still works. All right, so as you can see, our JS type thing changed a little bit to match the database. SQL got a lot simpler, and then the binds, we just had to say what it was and then specify that value. So we can run this guy. And we get the same result, so working just fine. Now, the second example, that example was just a single record type. The second example got a bit more complex because we have an array of those record types. So here's the before. Things are starting to get a little bit more ridiculous. And what we have is some boilerplate code here. I want to get about 500 unique things, if you will. And what I had to do in the past is declare some JavaScript variables, because you can imagine you might get these things either from reading a file, it could be a JSON, CSV file, whatever. You read a file, or perhaps you call a network API. In either case, you end up with a bunch of things in JavaScript world, which you then need to move into Oracle database. And what I found I had to do was first split up this thing here, this array of things, into separate arrays, separate scalar arrays. And the reason for that is that's what the driver supported at the time. And in fact, the last one here, which is the date array, if you will, I couldn't use that directly. I had to convert the date to an ISO 8601 string, move it into the database, and then convert it back to a date. And the boilerplate code to support all of this, as you can see, I'm not going to even step through it. It was a little ridiculous. All I really wanted to do was this, calling proc2, which takes in that array, and it just took a lot of code to get it done. But at the end of the day, it did work just fine. Now that we have direct support for objects, things changed a bit. Now the get things is going to change those labels again for my object to match what the database has. So we get 500 things. My SQL here, dead simple. I'm just calling proc2, passing that array of things. And here, I just say what it is. Oops, gotta add my schema so I don't get yelled at. And then the value. And so that was all it took now. So we went from 116 lines of code down to about 57. So it really starts to make a difference here when the types are a bit more complex. We're working with arrays instead of just a scalar record type. So let's see if I can actually call it now that I've modified it a bit.
And that will also obviously impact performance beneficially.
Oh yeah, this one's much better. All right, so
it's worth noting that objects do have some overhead. There's a lot of type instantiation, all sorts of things going on the database end. I know there's maybe some cases where you might want to do convert things to a table and do some streaming. If you look at some of the DBMS SQL examples of old DBMS output examples in the Node-oracledb examples directory, you'll see a way to convert DBMS output so you can just stream it, so you can do a query to get output. So it may be worthwhile playing around if you're in a very performance sensitive situation.
Cool. And the last example I want to show is based on this post here in Stack Overflow, where somebody said they have some custom types in the database, and they're basically invoking. Let me show you this over here. So these are the custom types. They have a simple record type and then a more complex type. And I believe, yeah, they are calling a package. Am I not seeing it here? There it is. Okay. So basically, they want to invoke this procedure, which, as you can see, it takes in some really simple types coming in. It's the out type that is a bit complex. It's a table of custom object types. So the question is, how do we go about doing this? Well, before, it would look something like this. So here's my PL SQL. Again, the wrapper in the previous cases, because they were going in, the wrapper logic was a little above what I wanted to call. But in this case, the difference is the complex type is what's coming out. And so you see that wrapper code after the fact. So basically, I declare an instance of the type that's coming out. I can pass in my simple binds, get this instance coming out, and then what I have to do is iterate over it, and again, break it down from a complex type to simple array types, which were supported for outbinds. And then I would have one of these outbinds for each of the types. And at the end, the person really wanted a single object, so I would then need to iterate over all of my arrays and bring them back into an array of objects, a single array of objects, and then I could just log that out. So we can see that run here.
How many lines of code was that?
Oh, it's a good question. Let me see. This one is 101 lines of code. And the after, as you'll see, is just a whole lot easier to work with. So the SQL, down to exactly the essence of what I want. No wrapper code going on here. And then for the binds, we had some simple binds going in. The only complex one was this bind out, which was based on this type. And I didn't have time to do maybe one last little iteration over the result to get it exactly like it was in the before. But you'll see here, it works fine as is. So technically, I wouldn't need to do that if it wasn't required. We fire that off. What you're seeing, this is the difference I was explaining. So this is what I had specifically coded before. Here, what I'm getting back on the outbinds is an array that I would need to iterate over and break down into a similar format. I could do that if I wanted just a few extra lines of code, but we're down now to 47. I suppose if I added something like this little loop might take us up to, say, 58, 55 lines of code, but we're still cutting the code in half with this example as well. And this one was a real life example, just taken a Stack Overflow. So pretty powerful stuff. Really glad to see the object support land, even just for simple PL/SQL record types. I think it's really important to simplify as much as we can. Are there any questions on anything we just went over? Or anything completely unrelated to anything we just went over?
Anthony's popped up something in the chat if you want to ask a question.
I don't know if it's worth discussing, Chris. There are two different approaches. I consistently used one, which Anthony said you were a big advocate for. But there's this ability, and this support is documenting this ability to sort of bring the types that you declare in the database, the custom object types, and bring those back into JavaScript land and use these classes to instantiate instances and then pass those in. But I just skipped that entirely and went right to, telling the driver I just passed a JavaScript type and told it what database type it was, and then the driver basically behind the scenes did all that heavy lifting for me. Is that something you'd want to touch on?
I just sorry, just trying to share so I can get an example back up. If I can move the Zoom overlays over. And of course I have so many examples now, I can't remember which one I want to show.
Your select geometry one?
Yeah,
I think I have
slept object, maybe the start one, I think. So this is example out there, GitHub, the Node-oracledb examples. And what I'm showing down here are different ways to actually work insert method 1, insert method 2, etc., etc., etc. So, and Dan was showing effectively
right there, the const harvest type.
Yeah, that's the second one. I was trying to show what you had done before, which is effectively, so you were effectively doing this method where you were
exactly
the string format of the type name bind, and then the other way is, and this is a little more complex up here because I'm kind of constructing things to pass in, but where has it got to? And that's a nested object, so the top level object is this one here. So we have a get DB object class method. So just below, I showed you where we're passing the string name directly as the bind type when we did the bind object. Here we actually just create a constant type, and then we can pass that lower down where I actually had it. Some of these things are different methods because this one object already knows what kind of type it is, so when you bind
it's interesting showing what you're doing there, because what comes back from the database is essentially a constructor function that matches what you've created in the database.
Yeah.
So when you have I don't know what line that is, but when you're saying new farm type, you're then creating a new instance of this class, which is a direct map to what's in the database. So if you prefer, working with this sort of object-oriented style programming, you're doing it in the database, you want to do it in JavaScript and sort of keep that parity a little bit closer to each other, then this is supported. You can do this.
Yep. And going back to the round trip things, once you've done this, get DB object class, and you kind of keep this constant around everywhere. So you're kind of basically a pointer into that local cache, and then you can use that lower down, new farm types, pass that constant as the type value. So you don't have issues of whether or not you should be using fully qualified names for the type, which I'm not doing here, basically because this demo is able to be installed into any schema, and I don't really know which schema you're going to install it into as a user. So this demo select object does show various ways for basically working with the type system itself. But Anthony has put a lot of effort into trying to make it simple so that you can do things just like here, just pass the name of the database type. This is the database side type name into Node-oracledb, and Node-oracledb would then work out how to map your values directly. So, and there are other examples in there. Anthony was pointing me to a select geometry. So Oracle Spatial is a part of the database which is available with all database editions, part of our bigger spatial offering. But there's the spatial bit is, the locator bit is available everywhere. Spatial is the bigger picture. So Oracle Locator is available, and you can use these predefined types for spatial objects. And there's a bunch of methodology captured in the database, implemented in PL SQL, which we pre-supply, Oracle pre-supplies. And you can now, with this object format, we saw this before, we get the Node-oracledb representation of the Oracle database type. We can use it in the constructor, and these are actually subtypes, which we don't have to do the get class for. It's automatically discovered for us, and basically just insert immediately. So you kind of get direct access to the spatial infrastructure, which is really cool. That's just one little side benefit there of having this. Obviously, you could have done this with the PL SQL wrappers that Anthony, Dan, I haven't had breakfast yet. It's early in the morning for me, that Dan showed, but it's now a lot easier with the named type support. Nobody's asked any questions. Shall we wrap it up at the half hour?
Sounds good.
Okay, let me go back to the, oops, and I'm supposed to be sharing this. Hopefully you can just see the slideware, so that we do have some resources there if you want to contact us in any method. One thing I will mention, it might have flashed up there on the screen very quickly, is that we do have, courtesy of community contribution, Connor Fitzgerald's updated type definitions for Node-oracledb 4.0. So that's available now. He mentions one little proviso there, but when I click through the reference, it says it was bug fixed. So presumably that's not an issue anymore. But that's really cool to see contributions in from users. And with that, let's wrap up. Thank you very much for attending the office hours this month. I think next month we will not be running because we have our big Oracle OpenWorld conference, and we kind of have a clash resources and dates and times. Dan, is that your understanding as well?
I'd have to take a look at the schedule, but that may be the case, yeah.
Okay, I know I'm kind of traveling around the time, so I think I probably won't be in attendance. But just keep an eye anyway on the office hours page. And if you've subscribed for mail notifications, you'll get the notification whether it's on or off. And certainly we'll be around in October to recap, definitely. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Bye-bye now.